Sì, sì. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for this invitation that I'm happy to have accepted and to talk about the connection of like economic categories, the study of history. And I think among all the speakers in this seminar, I would be sort of heretic or heterodox, since as a Marxian scholar, we can say that we have a sort of different paradigma if compared with the mainstream or standard economic studies. And so in Marx context, we don't have microeconomics or microeconomics, but a different holistic approach that, of course, provide us with different tools, not necessarily better or worse, but a sort of different view on economy and history. And so the title of my presentation is Reassessing Historical Materialism. So historical materialism, as well known, it's Marx's theory of history. That is actually not just a theory of history, but a theory in an holistic sense that nowadays is, it's a little because of the specialism of the division of sciences in many different branches, each one very specialized. Maybe Marx's approach is one of the last that try to put everything together, that is to find the connecting links between different disciplines, basically. And so, and since this is the anniversary of Antonio Labriola, one of the first Marxist philosopher in Italy. So I like to start with the distinction that he made between res geste and historia rerum gestarum. A distinction that actually we can also find in Hegel, and it's basically so outlining the difference between the the reconstruction that historians made of past history, and a theory of history as a theory of the logic of historical phenomena. So the res geste is like an attempt to theorize why things happen that way. By the historia rerum gestarum is the narrative, so the scientific reconstruction that historians made of what has happened already. And Marx theory is in between these two lines. And in this sense, Marx theory is not just an historical criterion of reconstruction in the past, but in philosophical terms, it is an ontology. That is like a science of being. That is the general definition of ontology. But if compared with other ontologies of the 20th century, the main difference is that Marx ontology conceives sign as a process. And so being is not just something that is, but something that becomes, essentially. So an idea of temporality of historical transformation, according to Marx, is inside the thing itself. And this theory relies on production. That is the main title of my presentation. So according to Marx, production is the key point of human history. And as such, is always a collective phenomenon. So this is, and so because Marx introduces a distinction between the labor process and production that are not the same, and because of this distinction, he thinks he is able to develop a theory of historical continuity that passes through discontinuities. So this is the main attempt of his philosophy, that is to keep together the continuity of what is human, that is human in different periods, but at the same time to be able to have a theory of breaking points. And so the human is not always the same, but is itself a process of becoming human, or redefining what human means at every stage of its development. And this is a first, still some already a first criticism of mainstream theory, mostly mainstream theory. So what for Marx would be mainstream theories, based mostly to a methodological individualism, the idea of a transhistorical human that, as for their essence, is more or less always the same. So this is one of the key categories of standard economics. No, the rational human that maximizes his profit or outputs given short inputs, basically. And while, according to Marx, so the concept of human is itself made. That is, as I said before, at every stage becomes something different and new on the basis of what happened before. So there is a constant redefinition of what human means. And so this process is not outside of nature. It's basically, according to Marx, humans are basically animals that in particular are able to work and so to produce. That is, the capacity of working and producing is what, according to Marx, makes this strange animal a human being. So the breaking point between, so the distinguishing characteristic of humans is the capacity to work. But at the same time, the labor process is not just made by an abstract human. It's made through different objects and on objects that belong to nature themselves. And so the productive activity is something that is, in Marx terms, materialistic since the very beginning, because it implies a specific part of nature. So humanity is a specific part of nature. And so what humanity produces is natural, social, social and historical at the same time. It is what was called the second nature. What the philosophical tradition of the Western world has been called the second nature, starting probably with Aristotle, and then from Cicero ongoing, it's something that is a standard, at least of the Western culture. And so, a society without production, according to Marx, does not exist. So that's the key point. And so, as I was trying to emphasize, Marx attempts is to, and so given that we have a peculiar human history that is their history if compared with the activity of other animals, but that's not enough, because Marx wants more. That is, it's not happy with just a generic human history. He tries to think a human history that is made of periods that are constitute essentially different one from the other. And the key point in this distinction is the different modes of production. And so production is not just the key element of human history, but the differences in modes of production is the key to understand the different periods of human history. And in each of this period, human would mean something that not necessarily is the same in others. I will give some examples. The second passage is that production is reproduction. That is, according to Marx, every society does not just need to produce, but to produce the conditions of continuing production. So you don't have, otherwise it would not survive the first productive process. And so production needs to be essentially reproduction. And so a production theory is at the same time a reproduction theory. And at the same time, so the other basic concept is the concept of surplus. Each society needs to produce an extra over what is essentially necessary to survive, so that there is a margin of for some people not to work, for some people to do something else. That can be many different things, and from making war, making science, becoming a politician, becoming a pope or whatever form of religion. And so this is just possible with surplus. And without this surplus, we don't, always according to Marx, there is no actual history, because that's the passage needed to have a complex society, a society with a more sophisticated division of labor, and also in so-called intellectual activities. And so a theory of historical transformation is not a reconstruction or narrative of historical transformations. So what Marx wants to do is not to tell the story of capitalism, is not to tell the story of medieval production, but to understand the logic of transformation of these systems and to say why something happens like that. So he's trying to figure out the laws of historical transformation. So it's a sort of science of history. So that's the big atom, the big challenge that he tries to develop. And so the point for also, I think, for historians is the relationship between models and the telling, the reconstruction of the facts. Models rely on this reconstruction, but can't be reduced just to the narrative of historical facts. It's an attempt to say how a society works beyond the factual historical existence of that society. That is, how the law of physics as such don't exist concretely in reality. We have physical events based on physics. The theory of those events is abstract physics. So a little bit, the idea of Marx is that, to develop a model of society that can explain then the functioning of different societies in history. So this idea that society is built on production historically has caused very well-known criticisms that are fair, but I don't think that really apply to Marx. So there are simplification of his thought. So that reproduction is the constitutive core of every society does not mean that all aspects of society can be reduced to production. It's not the same thing. To say that production is essential does not mean that everything is production, or that there is no autonomy of other spheres. The point is to find the connecting link with production. Something else is just to say, just abstractly derives from production, but without explaining how. Same story. What is built on production is inessential. This is another of the historical criticisms. Now, what matters is production, and the rest is just appearance. It's not really, doesn't matter. Absolutely not. So that's not Marx's idea. And the other prejudice is that whatever appears at the surface, at the phenomenal level of society, is mechanically determined by the structure. This is still a simplification that historically was very popular, but it's not. I don't think applies to Marx. Again, thinking that production is essential does not mean that there is just production, on that the rest doesn't count, on the rest it just comes out automatically. So that's not at all. It simply means that culture, institutions, customs can't be conceived without production and in some sort of structural relationship with production. That's the point. So according to Marx, we have to find how things work within a framework that is based on production, but that as such is more complex. And so then this theory is supposed to answer big questions. So how can the structural relationship between production and institutions be shown? the simple assumption that everything somehow relies on production, of course, does not explain anything. So this is the old criticism of determinism. So that in the 19th century was raised against Marx, that everything relies on production. And so, but the challenge is to show how institutions can be derived from that. And the second point, is there the possibility to explain the passage from one system to the other? And so the big two challenges of Marx are, first, to think how a society works itself, for instance, the capitalist mode of production. Second, to see if it is possible to think the passage from this system to another system, or to previous system to the current one. And so the historical chain between different systems. And so there are two logics then. The logic of the present, let's say, of the current mode of production, and then the logic that connects or not different modes of production, one with the other. So that these are the two main questions Marx is trying to answer. And so is there a transformation dynamics inside each system? Does this dynamics just perpetuate the same conditions of existence? Or is it in the long run self-destructive? Or does this dynamics tend to create the conditions of passage to another system? So these are all questions that this theory asks, and that for historians are possible guidelines to investigate, periods. That is, if we assume that the theory of the present as an internal dynamic, we can look in history for the passages of these dynamics, the determinate transformations that happened or not. How is this dynamic? Is self-destructive in the sense that the model not just repeats, but tends to destroy itself or not? Or is the model of the present positing conditions that can let us pass to a different model or not? So these questions that Marx asks for the capitalist mode of production can, in theory, be replaced as hypotheses in other modes of production, in other periods. And so, again, for historians, these can be guidelines to see if in other models we can find similar logic, a logic of self-transformation, a logic of flat repetition, logic of self-destruction or not. Of course, these are just question marks. It's not that there is the answer. These are possible, again, guidelines, questions, so that we can, historians can have, some sort of framework. And are these conditions themselves, the conditions that we have in the present system, just necessary, but also sufficient to pass to another system? So this is a big question in history of philosophy, but not just in history of philosophy, if there is a sort of theological trend in history. So if every system itself has an internal logic that creates the next one, so that implies all the passages to go to the next one. This is a famous criticism that has been raised against Marx. So the idea that there is the necessity in history is so strict that actually there is a sort of mechanic that implies all passages, and not just from capitalism to the other. No, historically, there is the famous criticism according to which all societies are supposed to pass through the age that Marx lists in the preface of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, sort of mechanically, and or not. So I think that this is, again, a very interesting question for historians. So we can find in every period all the necessary and sufficient conditions to pass from one system to the other, because it's very easy. So it's easier to find the necessary conditions, but it's hard to say that all of these are sufficient to pass to another system. So in this dialectic of necessary conditions and sufficient conditions, we can have a way out of determinism. And so all these ideas that I've tried to summarize are expressed by Marx in the famous label historical materialism, which actually is not by Marx. It, as a title, was created by Engels after Marx died, actually, so several years after Marx died. And the other famous definition of his theory of history is the materialist conception of history, materialistische Geschichtsauffassung, that still is by Engels. This is not by Marx itself, but was presented by Engels, Marx alive in the anti-dueling. So Marx saw it, didn't say anything against, but he never used that. So it's still a little tricky. So it's we label Marx theory with categories that he didn't use himself. So which is sort of interesting. And so Marx develops a theory of the present that he calls the capitalist mode of production as a dynamic model. So this is based on production. And in what sense it is dynamic? In the sense that there is a starting point, not just historically, but a logical starting point. That is, the capitalist mode of production can't exist if there are not logically, theoretically, certain premises that are mainly the separation of the labor power and means of production and the accumulation of a certain quantity of money. So this is not just historical, it's a logical starting point. As long as we don't have these premises, we don't have this model working. And then it thinks this model with the dynamic, that is a system that even if started with preconditions that are not posited by the system itself, at some point the system posits these presuppositions. So from a condition where he relies on premise, the system relied on premises that were outside of the system, at some point the system produces this as its own result. And then more, there is a passage according to which this system enters in an internal contradiction, that is, the same laws that allowed development of the system now stops it. So creates barriers and to the further development of that. And so in this sense, this is an end. And so there is a beginning that is not posited by capitalism. There is a development that is according to capitalist laws. And then there is an end in the sense that laws that allowed such a development now stops it. So in this sense, the model is temporal because it has a logical time that does not necessarily correspond to any empirical historical phenomenon or to empirical facts. It's just a logical model that has an internal temporality. And of course, Marx, when Marx made this theory, he was inside history, so he was aware of the historical transformations, and he started writing his theory on the basis of this historical experience. But then he tried to make a model that is an abstract theory of this historical transformation. That, as such, is not concrete capitalism. Is an abstract theory of capitalism. Is an abstract model of what the genus capitalism is, on the basis of which we can investigate capitalisms, concrete capitalism, and also try to see how it started historically, how it transformed historically. And so it's a sort of, grammar, theory of the language of capitalism that allows social theorists to go after concrete history, concrete social phenomenon, and so on. And since this system has a temporality, it implies a before and possibly an after. So a time where these models didn't apply because the premises that I mentioned didn't exist. And so in his limited temporality in the present, he implies a before and an after. So it's a passage in a logical history, let's say. And of course, this outline of history as a logic of systems is not made up, but constructed on the basis of the historical knowledge of the past and of previous formulation of the same kind. but it provides a framework with definitions that allows further historical investigations. For instance, capitalist and non-capitalist society. So the easiest question that historians can ask. Or also inside capitalism, the phases when capitalists relied on external premises. When was it? Or the period where capitalists become self-sufficient, or the period in which capitalist is trying to stop the potentialities that it has created. And just to give an idea of how this relies on production, just a very brief outline of the two basic concepts, that is labor process and production. So the labor process, as I said, is what Marx thinks is common to every human over history, and is basically labor itself, so labor power in act, means of labor, object of labor, and the finalism, that is already, so the object before it is realized is already in the mind of the worker, so, and then the product as a final result. So if the presence of the labor process is what is constant throughout human history, and the fact that these workers together need to collaborate to produce, it's not implied that every phases has the same mode of production. And here there are two differentiations to underline. So a first one is that Marx says that different periods are characterized by the different ways that all the moments of the labor process combine. That is, in a capitalist society, we have the labor power on the one hand without the means of production, and the means of production that are property of someone else, so the capitalist. And so in order to become a labor process, the combination of these elements takes place through a contract, basically. So the wage workers that sell their capacity to work to the capitalist, and then the production process takes place as a moment of capital. So human reproduction takes place as a moment of capital, basically. But in other systems, it was not like this. So Marx says, for instance, that in a system based on slavery, we have that the labor power itself is an object that is property of the landlord. And so the combination of the elements does not happen through a contract, through like the worker that sells is their activity, but it's just, happens as private property of the land. Or, for instance, in the feudal system, we have that in some cases, so the peasant is owner of the means of production, and so in the surplus is realized through the free service in the property of the landlord. So, for instance, these three different combinations, or two different ways the moments of the labor process combine, are a first passage to define the differences between different periods. The second passage is actually the transformation that the productive process undergoes within the different systems. And in particular, according to Marx, the way the labor process takes place is substantially changed by the capitalist production, because the former individual activity now takes place not as individual, but as a cooperative activity, where the single worker becomes what? A part of the process, just a part. So they don't realize all the pieces or all the product, but just a part. And so therefore the cooperative character of the productive process becomes structural, because the single ones are not able anymore to produce the entire thing. And so the social character of production is not just a mediation through the exchange of products after production. So the social character of production becomes the structure itself of production, because no one is able anymore to do everything on their own. And the further passage is the subordination of the labor force to a process that becomes objective, a sort of objective subject that under which the single workers act as such. And so these transformations that, according to Marx, take place in the capital system, again, for historians, can be guidelines to see when it happened, also how it happened. Did it happen everywhere in the same way? Did it happen everywhere? Because in some place it has not happened yet, or maybe it's not going to happen at all because capitalism stopped to develop. And so, again, it's a framework that defines what a period is, what particular categories in this period, develop, and so can be again directions. And limits of Marx's theory of capital. So this big project of historical materialism, in theory, included entire history. So according to Marx, we could investigate back to the Asian system, to the antiquity, to the feudal system, and so on. And as a matter of fact, it didn't do that. it didn't. It barely finished the capital. And so when, if on the one hand we have developed the theory of capital, and so of its temporality and its limits, how do we apply these to other possible models? So this is still a big question, because he basically, he tried. He said, okay, there are these other periods on the basis of the historical knowledge of the time. There is an Asian system, there is an Greek and Roman system based on slavery, but actually it's very much based on, the evidence of the classics. There was no archaeological evidence, so at least not at the level we have today. And so probably the differentiation that he provided needs to be further investigated and probably reframed on the basis of current knowledge. For instance, he was convinced that in the Greek and Roman times, slavery was the core point of everything, while as far as I can read from more recent historical research, it's not necessarily like that, or at least all over the ancient times. So it's some places it's just partial, and some places it's not. And so this part is to be written, basically. So Marx just so Marx still provides guidelines. That is, are these possible systems of the past, do they have an internal logic? This internal logic as a trend is just repetitive, is self-destructive. So we can ask history about that. So that's the point, to see if these other models work or not the same way the capitalist system. And so that's what I was saying. So this idea, Marx says that it is like that because he, tends to generalize the conclusions he drew from the capitalist system to the other systems. So I think this can't be accepted as such. So of course, in order to answer all these questions, we need the theory of the Asian economy, if it is a category. We need the theory of the feudal system, again, if this is a category or not. So even if Marx did answer, we have possible questions to go after these possible models. And sorry. This is what I was saying. So the Asian, the ancient, the feudal, modern bourgeois period. In the historical debate, these were taken very seriously, too much. So since Marx was Marx Capital was the new Bible, so Marx was the new God, and God can't fail. So they needed to, to say that it was like that. So now we don't need to do that, but we can just use these as potential good ideas to see if it's actually like that or not. And so, as a matter of fact, as long as we don't have models of those systems, this sequence, that one proposed by Marx, simply does not mean anything. The same names becomes just labels on empty boxes. This is a part of the story completely to write. Also because the new understanding that we have today of ancient societies compared to Marx times has consistently changed our perspectives. And so this is something that Marx could not do, basically, because it didn't have, enough information to go after this stuff. The same, to some extent, can be applied to capital itself. Even if he had very good ideas about the financial development of capitalism, but at the same time, this side of the story was still ongoing, so developed consistently later on. Again, so we have good starting points, but that need to be further investigated. Just the last remark, so done. So the idea of the historical connection between different periods, if the passage from one to the other is mechanically necessary or not. So Marx was a theorist of society, but was also a politician. And as such, in my opinion, in some cases, he exaggerated a little in the sense he emphasized the necessity of the historical passage to future society. I think this is very much due to the political part of the story. Like if I want to encourage people to do the revolution, if I say maybe, maybe not, it's not a big, it's not a big push. So I need to say it's like that. There is no doubts. But theoretically, we can actually move forward in this part and see if this is strictly necessary. So I don't think that its theory implies a strict necessity of this passage. And the point is the one I mentioned before. So the difference between necessary premises and sufficient premises. And I think that for sure, Marx's theory of capital shows how the capitalist mode of production creates possibilities, very concrete possibilities of a further development of humanity, like the incredible progress in the productive forces, the science. So the development of science is strictly connected to the development of production. Also, the world organization of economy, basically. So the idea of human being that before was an abstraction has become a concrete fact. So the fact that the world reproduction is so interconnected that actually issues here are immediately connected with issues on the other side of the world. So, and there are now problems and issues that are at the human level. So just humanity as such can deal with, global warming, the new international order. This is not something that, single individuals or single states here and there can manage. It's a world problem. So, and so these at the same time are possibilities for a different organization. The point is that all the presuppositions are there or not. So my personal interpretation is that the capitalist mode of production does not create all the necessary and sufficient conditions of the passage. And this allows us to have a sort of range of freedom, let's say, to work on the potential actualization of progress or not. So there is like a range of a spectrum of possibilities. But I think this is very interesting also for the investigation of the past. So why capitalism did not start in the ancient times? As I read also in the ancient times, there was in some places the division of labor power and means of production. There was there were wage workers, there was an accumulation so basically the preconditions of capitalism existed. Why capitalism did not start? And so if we have in some periods, the market that developed up to 20% of the general circulation of production, why that didn't pass to capitalism? So because these conditions that Marx thought were sufficient and necessary probably were just necessary but not sufficient. And this, again, allows, I think, for historians, it provides historians with a guideline to see what are the missing ones. So what are those conditions that past systems did not produce, and that randomly for some, some interactions that we need to better understand, in the end allowed capitalism to start. This way, I think that we are out of the strict determinism of systems that produce other systems in a very, mechanical way, and we have a spectrum of freedom for us politically, but also a spectrum of investigation for historians of the past that can literally look for the differences and look for the points that made that possible or not. Thank you.
So thank you very much to Professor Fineschi for this extremely effective, clear. Sì, devo smettere.